But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we explore the life of General Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist behind Japan's naval plans during World War II. A Harvard-educated visionary, Yamamoto understood the risks of war with the United States but crafted bold strategies, including the attack on Pearl Harbor that reshaped the Pacific theater. Amidst the shifting tides of war, his vision and leadership embodied both the ingenuity and the contradiction of Japan's wartime strategy. His innovations in naval aviation reshaped modern warfare, while his ultimate fate marked a turning point in the Pacific theater. Join us as we uncover the life and legacy of this fascinating and pivotal figure. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we'll be exploring the life of Isoroku Yamamoto, who's really known for being the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and probably Japan, specifically Imperial Japan's most strategic military strategist. And when we came into this, it was super interesting because we all know the story of Pearl Harbor. We know that Japan is going through really large changes. But what I think is most interesting about Yamamoto himself is not only did he spend time in America learning naval warfare and being educated, but he also has a really deep understanding of American way of life, American culture, and the American military. Yet he's still involved in probably one of the most infamous battles in the entire history of the United States. And I think that's what makes this story so interesting, because I think going into this, we were thinking, hey, Japanese strategists planned out this attack, but really he knows his enemy probably as well as anybody else. And I think that's what's going to make this story really, really fascinating.
I think that's one of the really interesting, cool, captivating elements of this particular discussion. And for me personally, as a huge history geek, the way that Japan's transformation kind of is inseparable from his life. I don't know if you had this, I won't call it a problem, but just kind of realization that every time I searched him up, there was something about Japan almost immediately after. Like the idea of talking about the person and the nation separately, almost did not exist on any web search. At some point, I really had to do some deep diving to kind of parse those two out, and it was still very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, because you're right. It's not that they're just inseparable, but almost the change in not only culture, but military theory in a sense, and this industrialization and almost change of the way Japan is going to wage war is really being fed by the changes that Yamamoto is putting forward from, researching in the West and learning from the West, and also just being a really good student of naval warfare and warfare in general. So you're right. It's interesting because you can't just say, well, here's Yamamoto and here's Japan and here's how Japan influenced him. It's kind of going back and forth, and they're so interwoven. Despite the fact he's growing up in a culture that's rapidly changing, he now finds a chance to kind of step his foot into that ring and actually put his mark on that change, which I think is so interesting because of how quickly things are changing. And we're starting to see, some of these architects who I guess we could say are kind of coming at the end of this Imperial Japan sort of way of life as, things end abruptly at the end of World War II. But, not only is it in high gear, but things are changing really quickly, and he's going to play a huge part in that.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think to talk about one without the other would not do justice to either. But, it's a very fine line we have to kind of wade to be able to do justice to this discussion, because without the context of what's going on in Japan, I think that, and that predates him, he's almost a man that's caught between two worlds. This idea of tradition and what we'll see is this kind of growing desire for being a more modern nation really gives him a deep understanding, because he's growing up in it, about his nation's own limitations. But then there's this, cultural aspect of a fierce loyalty that, compelled him to serve the ambitions of the nation he grew up in.
Yeah, and he's not only loyal to it, he wants to change it and he wants to move it forward. So you kind of have a little bit of both here, but you're right, it's one and the same. And he's not, I think it was just as we were going through this, right, is, we have this version of Imperial Japan. And I think what was most interesting, and we'll get into this now, I guess, is, if you're watching the show Shogun or any of these kind of feudalistic Japanese type of, pieces of culture out there, it seems like they're two completely separate worlds separated by hundreds of years. But really, it almost seems like, it was that world. And then overnight, oh, here we are in this new Imperial Japan. And we're going from old style classic Japanese warfare into the mechanized warfare and, aircraft carriers and everything that we know from Imperial Japan at this point. That, I think, is what's so fascinating, is how quickly things change. And then you throw someone like Yamamoto in, and people like him are just going to kind of keep pushing things in that direction and almost jumpstart it to, a level that gets them to the point where they're one of the most powerful nations in the world.
Yeah, their transformation is incredible. The rate and speed at which they're able to accomplish this for a nation that historically was isolated. And we could probably get into the context now. When we're talking about Yamamoto's lifetime, we're talking about 1884 to 1943 if we're going to bookend it. But to understand him, you actually have to take it back probably 250 years. And this is because Japan at the time is emerging from centuries of self-imposed isolation. This is under the Tokugawa shogunate, which was in power since 1603. And they had enforced a policy of sakoku, which is pretty much near total seclusion from the outside world. Foreign trade was very limited to a few tightly controlled ports, primarily with the Dutch and the Chinese, and Western influence was strictly curtailed. Christianity was outlawed, and Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad. So you can, start to get a sense of, the degree to which they are trying to protect their country from any outside influence. And while sakoku was did preserve Japan's cultural and social traditions, the place where it kind of left a weakness is that it was technologically stagnant. So by the mid-19th century, you have these Western powers that are rapidly industrializing. They're building empires. They're expanding their influence across Asia. But Japan's isolation kind of renders it vulnerable to these encroachment because it lagged behind in any kind of, meaningful military technology or industrial development compared to its other counterpart. And the consequences of this stagnation became very evident when Japan encountered the Western powers for the first time.
It's so interesting because it's right in this age of imperialism, and we see so many other nations who are somewhat welcoming to these Western powers in a sense, welcoming trade, welcoming influences in certain ways. And then before they know it, their entire nation is taken over either economically or by force. Mm-hmm. And you can see it from Japan's perspective of seeing what everything else is going on and them being more of a traditional society. They're also on an island too, which also makes things a bit easier. But you're right. The progress and the change that's happening all over the world relies on all of these nations sharing ideas and science and all these techniques when it comes to building things from an industrialization perspective. So there's definitely probably a time when this was a decision that probably worked out well for them and kept them out of the firing lines of some of these imperialist nations. But you're right, as they start to grow, as their ships can travel farther, as they get larger, as they can bring more troops and men, at some point they're going to come knocking on the door and they're going to say, well, hey, we're here, and what are you going to do about it? You've got swords and maybe cannons or bow and arrows, but we have destroyers or ironclad ships that, what are you going to do about what we have? So I think you're right. There comes a point where, things have to change relatively quickly. And I think lucky for Japan, they have a society in a sense that is ready, I would say, maybe to industrialize, or has the level of education and things like that where they can do something like this. But it's not something that's going to happen overnight, nor is it going to go over very well. But it's now become life or death, right? Because they will be picked apart very, very quickly if they don't modernize.
And this is pretty much what happens, right? So the shogunate, again, so it existed from 1603 to 1868. And this is a feudal military government that was focused on bringing peace and stability to Japan, and it lasted for over 250 years. It was centered in Edo, which is modern Tokyo, and the shogunate established a very rigid social hierarchy with the samurai class at the top, and they served as bureaucrats and enforcers. Then you would have regional lords referred to as daimos, which would govern their domains with very strict oversight, and it required them to spend alternating years in Edo to ensure loyalty, to make sure that the shogunate was always kind of this, overseeing power, and that those those regional enforcers had that kind of bonding connection with them. But Paul, to your foreshadowing, by the mid-19th century, there was a lot of internal economic strain and external pressures. The key thing, this watershed moment, is probably the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his ships in 1853. It essentially marked the end of over 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation. Perry's fleet, consisting of steam-powered vessels armed with advanced weaponry for the time, was a stark demonstration of Western technological and military superiority. And the sight of these imposing ships in, what is now the Tokyo Bay sent a clear and undeniable message to Japan's rulers. The world outside their borders had changed dramatically, and Japan needed to adapt or risk being left behind, or even worse, in this era, potentially even being colonized.
Yeah, you can imagine that. I just thinking back to, Cortez and the Aztecs, and obviously the technological gap is nowhere near what it was between the Spanish and the Aztecs. But, when somebody rolls in and they are 200, 300, maybe 400 years more advanced than you from a technological standpoint, and they roll up on your front door and say, hey, guess what? We're here, and, look how shiny our ships are, and this is what we want, and, we know there's nothing you can do about it. That's going to galvanize a nation that's very quick, especially one that's been not only so concerned about foreign influence into their society, but also just to keep power, right? You have 250 years of this shogunate. They're gonna want to keep power in some way, but like you mentioned, I think the rapid change that's needed, it's the old ways are gonna have to die, and they're gonna have to die very fast. But it doesn't get. They showed up. They've got these big ships. It's really that simple. What are you gonna do about it other than try to fight back with getting your technology to a level where you can actually stand a chance?
And they don't really at this point, right? They are very much on the receiving end of this show of force, and it results in a series of unequal treaties being signed. The Treaty of Kanagawa kind of set a precedent for other Western powers who quickly demanded other similar agreements. And, we've kind of heard this story, multiple times across different arenas, but, foreigners gained tariff controls. It allowed them to dictate trade terms that favored Western nations, legal inequities like extraterritorial rights that were exempted from foreigners from Japanese law. They created areas of foreign control within Japanese cities. Then obviously, for Japan, the cultural consequences of this type of action. The forced opening exposed Japan to a rapid cultural exchange, which seemingly they did not want, but had to deal with now. Imposition of these Western norms often clashed with this very traditional, deeply rooted Japanese values, which kind of, I would imagine, deepened the sense of national humiliation that they were not able to defend themselves.
Yeah, and we definitely know that that's a fact as we see how Japan, fights in World War II, and especially the culture that they're going to build around this modernization into this imperialist world around the emperor, of, this deep loyalty to Japan and to the nation and to the emperor. But you're right, there's always this level of humiliation and honor towards the Japanese society. And you're right, they're not going to, never mind the treaties are bad, but just the way it looks on the national stage, especially for people who have been just really fighting internally for such a long time and never really had, were never really defeated by someone who wasn't Japanese. There was always, I never like looking at a country as a monolith and saying, well, they're all Japanese, therefore they all think the same and everything like that. They're obviously broken up into different sections, but still in their eyes, these are all still Japanese people fighting Japanese people. And to be defeated by an outsider who really just kind of showed up with bigger ships and made you sign all these things, you're right, there's going to be some deep humiliation there. And we'll see very, very quickly how I'd also wonder how much of a galvanizing factor that was that really sped things along as quick as we're going to see.
Yeah, I would keep that last thought in mind about how galvanizing of an action that was, or, the event was, for what it would mean for Japan in the years to come. So essentially, in 1868, the shogunate falls. A coalition of samurai from the powerful domains overthrew the shogun during the Boshin War, and they ushered in this new era. It's called the Meiji Restoration, and it kind of symbolized the end of feudal rule and the beginning of Japan's transformation into a modern state. The emperor was restored to more of a position of symbolic authority, and a centralized government replaced the fragmented feudal structure that was in place, which paved the way for sweeping reforms. And again, this is a very transformative period in Japanese history. It's emerging from centuries of feudal rule of isolation, but but the leaders at this point now recognize the urgent need to modernize in order to protect the country's sovereignty, be able to revise these treaties that they are, the losers of essentially, and then compete with industrialized nations. So you see things like abolition of feudal domains. It was the feudal Han system, which allowed regional lords significant autonomy. That's abolished in 1871. You have the Meiji Constitution, which was written in 1889. And this is interesting. It's actually modeled after Western constitutional systems, particularly Prussia's, which is very interesting, which established a constitutional monarchy with a, legislator called the Diet. And while the emperor, again, kind of retained that authority, including supreme command of the military, the constitution marked Japan's first steps toward modern governance. And this also paved the way for a very modern legal system. And then, this is kind of, the momentum that you need, an inertia that leads to greater economic development. So now you see this uptick in industrialization with establishing state-owned enterprises when it comes to shipbuilding, steel production, textiles. You have massive infrastructure projects. We love railroads on this podcast. Japan is no different. You have ports, telegraph networks that are being created, agrarian reforms, so land reforms, which granted property rights to farmers, increasing agricultural productivity, and the military. So this is, largely an episode on a general in the Japanese military. They actually disbanded the samurai. So the samurai class was abolished as a distinct social order, with stipends replaced by government bonds. They had universal conscription implemented in 1873 and introduced the Imperial Japanese Navy. This was actually developed with British assistance. The Navy became a key element of Japan's defense and expansion strategy. And I think one last sentiment that I think you kind of touched on was this idea, and excuse my pronunciation of this, it's a philosophy known as Wakan Yosai, and it's this philosophy of Japanese spirit, Western techniques, which symbolized Japan's approach to modernization. While adopting Western technology, institutions, and practices, Japan wanted to preserve and redefine its own cultural identity as they saw fit.
As you were kind of going through all that, I kept just thinking like, wow, how fast this happens, right? It's 75 to maybe 100 years where you're going from abolishing the old ways of governance to not only putting in a constitution, but modernizing all of your industries. But I think that last piece that you just mentioned around, the Western ideas with the Japanese kind of culture and flair to it a little bit, I think kind of explains, maybe answers my question a little bit on, okay, look, we're going to adopt all these things that the West is doing that's successful, but we're going to put our own Japanese spin on it and make it our own. And I think that goes to show probably why they could do some of these things so quickly, because it wasn't like they were trying to force outside ideas in. And I'm sure there's some fantastic propaganda that went through on, how to get people to buy into these sort of things. And I'm sure people have fed up with old feudal systems at some point anyways. But I think that is so interesting just because, just in my head, I'm seeing Japan as we don't trust any outsiders ever to bring in all of these ideas and all this cool industry, and we're going to do it really, really fast and modernized. There's got to be a little bit of glue. And I think that last bit has to be a huge part of why it was able to work and work so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's such a unique perspective, right? They see how they are disadvantaged in relation to their counterparts, these European Western powers. They want to maintain their own self-identity, so they want to have that Japanese spirit, but they also realize that they're going to have to work with these Western and European powers to figure out what is making them, powerful, formidable, but how can they do it in a way that's going to unify and strengthen Japan as a nation. And I think this is probably a good transition point, because one of the things that, Paul and I were talking about offline was, imagine growing up in this massive period of transformation and evolution. And for someone like Isoroku Yamamoto, who is the star of today's episode, this rapid modernization could mean in some ways that it was both, a warning of what world he's coming into, but at the same time, a source of inspiration for, the nation that you're seeing evolve in front of your very eyes.
Yeah, I think it's got to be just a cool time to grow up in, but also kind of precarious on what the heck is going to happen next and what is this all going to mean? And, you're right. He's born into this world and he's trying to, I don't know if I think he's young enough and he's born late enough that it's all happening around him so fast. And that's kind of what he's used to. I think it'd be more of his parents and grandparents' generation who may, remember enough of the old world and are trying to kind of find their place in this. But Isoroku's born not actually into the Yamamoto family. He's born into the Takano family, which was, they were his father was an intermediate rank samurai. So, not high noble class, kind of just more of a regular kind of family at this point. But like you said, he's growing up with all these cultural shifts, embracing of Western technology, school are starting to adopt new teaching methods, and even Western advisors are arriving. So even it's not just learning things through the eyes of the Japanese as they do through this modernization process. He's actually seeing Western advisors coming through, and you're even seeing a lot of missionaries as well. So you're starting to see Christianity start to be taught and spread around Japan. And Isoroku, when he was young, definitely learned a little bit about Christianity, learned the Bible. There's some people out there who claim that he was actually a Christian, but that's mostly been disproven by historians. They think, yeah, he had some interest in Christianity, but never actually was a believer or, a convert. But, he grew up in a little wooden house with a pretty tough childhood, right? Like, basically doing what a typical peasant would do and working basically, all the time, but was still able to be educated, and grew up sick a lot, dealing with influenza. And again, we have to remember this transition's happening, but it's not overnight. And it looks like, he's still kind of going through a little bit of that modernization and trying to get away from the, hey, I got to work all day just to survive, to I can go study and learn and actually help bring, my nation forward. And like I mentioned, he definitely was introduced to Western missionaries, learning a little bit about the Bible, and learned a little bit of the English language at that time. And he actually started to become interested in some British and American cultures. His father had told him that American people were hairy, odorous barbarians who ate flesh. So, he's definitely coming from a world of, old school Japanese. Anybody who's not us is bad, and we're going to stay kind of within our world. But I think he's growing up in this change, and he's kind of excited by it. And classic, father son of parents tell you one thing, you're going to reject it. And, he's interested in watching baseball at a young age, and starting to learn a little bit about how American way of life is, and starting to take in a little bit of American culture. And, like I said, he's watching baseball, which will become, Japan's probably number one sport at some point. So he's seeing a lot of this, and, it's just new and it's interesting. And I think he's definitely probably that first generation who's born into this new world. And, he's trying to find where he is in it. But from what it sounds like, despite having a tougher childhood, I think he's definitely embracing a lot of these new changes. And he's definitely not going to be someone who's going to be holding on to, the old traditional ways of life.
It's an interesting anecdote of what his father said to him, right? Like it very much typifies the whole, sentiment that we've kind of been talking about thus far, is that why would you even want to work or get to know these barbarous cannibals who smell?
Yeah, that doesn't sound great at all.
But I think it just goes to show, right? Like it's that old guard, it's that old mentality that's still in place. And now you have this massive rift that's happening. And Yamamoto is, I don't want to say dead center, but he's in the middle of such a transformation in his country and the globe. And I think this is one of the challenging parts about this episode, is that for us to really understand his biography and, what drove him to make the decisions, not only do we have to understand what's happening in Japan, which is its own complexity, you have to be able to ground that in what's happening in the broader global context, right? So there's so many layers of analysis here to have some meaningful discussion about Yamamoto himself.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting is you mentioned all these layers of all these things changing, and I'm just hearing, like, kind of thinking back to what his father was saying. What I think is probably why he ends up being so successful is if from a young age you're open to all of this change that's happening, that's where the opportunities are going to be. And if you're going in gung-ho for all of these new different things, you're going to rise really, really quickly. And that's kind of what happens with him. He's a little bit fortunate along the way, but he decides that a career in the Navy is what he wants to do. So he applies to the Naval Academy. Of 300 applicants, he scores the second highest on his entrance exam. And he was only 16 years old. So he's not a man. He's still, a boy at this point. And, it's a really tough academy, rigid in terms of, they're not allowed to drink, smoke, eat sweets, talk to girls, do any of that stuff. It's, all business all the time. And so he does that for a few years. And then in his final year, he's actually aboard a naval vessel, kind of getting on the ground training. And then eventually graduates 7th in his class in 1904, which, if anybody kind of remembers our episode on Tsar Alexander, this is when the Russo-Japanese War kicks into high gear, and perfect timing for Isoroku. He's just graduated and he's jumping headfirst right into probably one of Japan's, in terms of naval combat, up to that point, definitely their biggest battle that they've ever had. And he's aboard the cruiser of a famous admiral named Admiral Togo, and he ends up going down as one of the heroes of Japan from this time period. And this battle that he's in is an absolute massacre and very good for the Japanese. They basically destroy the entire Russian fleet. So this is the first and kind of last at the same time encounter of these ironclad ships before we kind of get into the dreadnought era. And really the superior Japanese forces destroy all 12 of the Russian ships. Some historians kind of say, like, this is very rare that you see two sides who are pretty much evenly matched in terms of size and technology, and one side just absolutely obliterate the other side. And, that's what happens. But for Isoroku at this point, they win the battle, but he's actually wounded in action. So he was knocked unconscious when a shell hit the ship that he was on. His body was peppered with shell fragments, and he actually lost about if you think of the size of an orange, chunk out of his thigh. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand and actually spent 2 months in hospital. So he's definitely getting the glory of winning a battle, but he's definitely feeling it, and he's definitely going to have some battle wounds to go home with. So he's kind of goes home, but he's home to a hero's welcome, recovers, and he goes back to gunnery school where he was promoted to commander and started serving at the Imperial Naval Headquarters in Tokyo. And then he started doing training courses in China and Korea. And then we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but he's part of a squadron that's paid to visit ports along the American West Coast. So quite a journey there, and almost 5 years since he graduates from school, basically 7 to 8 years from going into school to getting wounded to being at a point where he's being sent on international expeditions. It's quite a lot that happens at a young age. And, talk about luck. He was able to get into this battle so quickly and really win glory for his country and for him, but, narrowly escapes death, at the exact same time.
And I think when you consider this in against the backdrop of what's happening in Japan more holistically, so you touched on the Russo-Japanese War. You also have the first Sino-Japanese War between Japan and China. This is the newly modernized Japanese military, which decisively defeats China. It gains control of Taiwan, secures influence of Korea. It's becoming very militaristic, and there is a growing sentiment of nationalism, and I would go as far to say even ultra-nationalist movements that are happening that are composed of young military officers who are advocating for a very aggressive foreign policy. And that's kind of fueled by economic and resource challenges as well, right? We have to consider that Japan is an island. Its natural resources are very limited, and it relies on imports, which makes it very vulnerable to economic, disruptions or embargoes, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. And, securing access to these resources, particularly oil, iron ore, and coal, become a central piece of Japan's foreign policy and, kind of is the driving force between its imperial expansion in Asia. So, this is the backdrop in what Yamamoto is kind of getting his first foray into military action.
Absolutely. And you're right. The resource piece cannot be understated. And we'll get into how he actually sees the entire piece of military warfare, at least on the naval side, down to time and oil, basically. That's how you're going to win these battles. But I think you're right, too, just on the success of Japan, too, at this point. You see them winning these battles pretty decisively, being able to kind of put their foot on the neck of their neighbors who aren't as powerful. And people are able to go from very humble beginnings to rock stars within Japan because of what they're doing in the military. And you're not only, Japan's always had this military tradition, but now with this change that's happening, young, ambitious men are starting to see very clearly that the path through the military is a pretty easy way to probably get a lot of money, but also gain that notoriety and gain that fame. And there's going to be a lot of people rushing to this, but there's only so many battles and so many wars that they can fight. And so you're going to start to get those hardliners come into the government who want to do more and more and more because you have all of this ambition that people want, and they see expansion and that imperialist kind of movement out of Japan to be the way to achieve that. And that's smack dab in the middle where Isoroku finds himself. And so in 1913, he finds himself appointed to the Naval Staff College. And this is where people are starting to realize that he's got a level of intelligence and energy that the military really respects, and they can see that there's something special with him. He's also known actually for being a very fierce gambler. He's known for staying up half the night playing different games. There's a Japanese version of chess that he's really fond of, and it's something that he'll do for the rest of his life, but it never seems to get to a point where it's like, selling off everything and it becomes almost an addiction in that sense. I think he really likes the mix of skill and luck because there's so many kind of pieces to warfare. And we'll get into why that's something that's kind of his MO as he goes forward. But this is a really important time for him because his parents actually both pass away at this point. And so I mentioned earlier, and we've been calling him Isoroku Yamamoto, he actually wasn't called that until this very point. He's actually adopted into the Yamamoto family. So they're a prominent family with really deep naval and political ties. And it allowed Isoroku to inherit the Yamamoto name and any associated status, paving the way for this further advancement in his naval career. So like we mentioned, the old kind of ways of samurai, hierarchical rank and those sort of things have kind of gone away, but it's human beings. There's always these families that are going to have this deep influence in the government and in society. And the Yamamoto family is one of those. And so he's basically adopted by the Yamamoto family. He changes his name, and this is actually quite common in Japan. We see this a lot, and so partially due to his skill, but I'm sure due to the political maneuverings and having the Yamamoto last name, he starts to advance up the military. He's promoted to lieutenant, then the next year lieutenant commander, and then he's back at the Navy Staff College in 1916. So he's already starting to move his way up, and we're getting to the point where kind of the ceiling for him is going to be getting to the rank of admiral and doing something big when it comes to warfare. But he's still a pretty young man at this time, still not married or anything yet. So there's a little bit to come, but he's got this name, he's got the intelligence, he's got the energy, he's got the education. He just needs to find his way within this world and, find what's going to be next for him.
It's an interesting contrast, right? And I think this kind of showcases the dynamism that's possible here in Japan, where, we are trying to modernize, but there's still this element of like traditional Japanese culture that's still very strong and embedded very deeply in society with, this former samurai name and class that still carries some weight and legacy and some grandeur to it, which I think for him kind of, not just him, but, across the social stratus of where he's existing at this time probably does add a bit more emphasis and grandeur to, all the accolades that he's already been able to accomplish in his very short life.
Absolutely. And as we see time go on, we'll see military postings be much more political, especially as, I guess, the interweaving of Japanese politics and military almost become one and the same as we get closer and closer to World War II. So definitely doesn't hurt. And I think it's important as he kind of moves through that, like I said, because they're going to get so interwoven. But time to look back to his personal life here. He ends up getting married. He ends up marrying a young lady. They end up seeing the birth of 4 children during their lives together. But right as he gets married, he is swept away to the United States. So he was actually posted to the U.S. as a, quote, special student in English at Harvard University, which he left in April 1919. And he was occupying rented rooms in the Boston suburb of Brookline. And he studied economics and petroleum sources at Harvard, along with 70 of his fellow countrymen. So, hey, he's not just going to the US, he's going to Harvard, right? So he's no slouch, that's for sure. And I like how he's not just studying economics, but he's studying petroleum sources, because obviously oil is becoming, the oil booms of, the late 19th century, early 20th century. He's going to understand very, very quickly about, the link between oil and naval warfare. And, no better place to do that than, Harvard University and being in the US at this time. But he actually adapts to American life pretty well. He, again, finds his gambling itch. He learns how to play bridge. He learns poker. And like I said before, he likes that mix of bluff, luck, anticipation, and it's exactly what you need in a great military commander. There's a little bit of everything. You have to be bold, but you also have to deceive, and you'd have to also be very smart to be able to kind of make these probabilistic guesses and calls when you need to. So he said, it became one of his lifelong passions, and a friend asked him how he learned bridge so quickly. He said, if I can keep 5,000 ideographs in my mind, it's not hard to learn 52 cards. So he's basically saying, look, I got to study all these things for my day job. What's studying 52 cards? So he's definitely mixing himself in really well. He's a diligent student. He's learning English. Rumors are he slept only 3 hours a night because he was just studying and probably playing cards all the time. But like I said, he learned a lot about oil, knowing that this is the lifeblood of any modern Navy. And he actually got so good with it that oil companies were actually offering him jobs, but he turned them down, and he was still at Harvard. And he's starting to see this interest in naval aviation. So the British Royal Navy in 1912 had started to talk a little bit about naval aviation and actually completed the world's first aircraft carrier in 1918. And so Yamamoto being the brilliant guy that he is starting to think about naval aviation a little bit and thinking, I think this might be the future. And we'll see how, this understanding and kind of this Western education and being closer to, some of the things that's happening out of the British world is really going to change his mindset when it comes to warfare. And it's going to be really important as, Japan looks to start conquering, parts of the Pacific.
Japanese spirit, Western technique, right? Like, I think this is the perfect example of that sentiment that we were talking about earlier during the Meiji Restoration. It almost seems like he's obviously developing a deep understanding of the United States, but I imagine going there for the first time, the awe of this potential formidable adversary that you're visiting, and to understand, how this is going to impact your strategic thinking, knowing that, America has so many more natural resources than you do. I wonder what that would do to the mind of a young countryman who is still very loyal and dedicated to, the evolution and advancement of Japan or any nation. Yeah. We're just talking about Japan now, but for anyone, like, what would that do to your psyche?
Absolutely. And for someone who's studying the oil industry and economics so much, he's seeing it before his very eyes as this industry is exploding and how quickly America is able to, find some oil reserves, tap it, and then distribute it all over the country and even export it to other countries. It just goes to show, like you said, you have that American entrepreneurship and you have all these natural resources, and then bang, this economy is going to grow really, really quickly. And again, he knows enough about warfare that, I think it's not a foregone conclusion, but the more industrial nation is probably going to win that war more than the one that has the best generals or the best tactics. And we'll see why that's important in a little bit. But he returns to Japan after spending some time in the US. And this is really, he's gone from promising young officer, a lot of ambitions, got the name, to really a trailblazer in Japanese naval aviation and really just all this modernization that's coming. So after he returns back, he's promoted to commander, and he's got his first major post at a new naval air station. And so Japan has created this training ground for naval aviators, and Yamamoto's in on the ground floor, and he really honed his experience in military aviation. So by 1926, he's risen to captain, commanding both light cruisers and a carrier, and then serving again in a attachment that went to Washington, again, where he's seeing this American industrial might. And he famously actually dismisses the U.S. Navy as more interested in leisure than operational rigor. Hey, these guys are just out kind of enjoying themselves on these boats. And he may have joked about that, but I think he understands that the American way of life is, they play hard, but when it comes time to get down to business, they can do things pretty quickly. So he returns to Japan and continues doing what he's doing in the naval aviation sphere. And he's actually promoted to rear admiral. And so, like I said before, he's just so into the potential of air power. He actually learns to fly at the age of 40 and advocates for superior naval aircraft. And he actually is championing the development of the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, which, for those who probably know, it's probably the biggest piece of technology that gave Japan the upper hand in the early days of World War II. American planes weren't able to keep up. British planes weren't able to keep up at this point. And having this built in with their Navy is so key in what they're trying to do. But he's starting to face some resistance. He has this, these more traditional admirals who are like, no, we need more dreadnoughts, more traditional battleships, less so than, aircraft carriers. So there's a little bit of back and forth where he's always trying to fight those fights, but he's actually also sent to this London Naval Conference where he's a chief delegate. And he actually gains international notoriety here because there was actually a treaty that had limited Japan's battleship growth. And he's able to dismantle that treaty and returns home as a national hero. And, he's still pushing for investments in carriers and innovative aircraft, but he's also helped dismantle some of the shackles that were put on Japan. So I think this is really important because, like we said before, that interweaving of politics and military leadership is starting to become more and more intertwined. We know he's a great military leader. We know he's a great innovator, but now we know he can be a rock star politician on the international stage. And it's the perfect combination for him to be able to have influence within the Japanese government, but then also turn around and get back out on the water when he needs to and do the things that, an admiral would do.
Yeah, and I think you touch on like the whole international relations piece, right? So we've discussed the unfair treaties when Matthew Perry came in and with the fall of the shogunate, but post World War I, there was the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which essentially was focused on limiting the size of Japan's navy relative to those of the U.S. and Great Britain. And obviously, you don't have to read in between the lines too much here, but it's obviously a deliberate attempt to, contain Japanese power and naval supremacy because they did see them as a threat.
Yeah, and I'm sure this long list of treaties that they've probably got put up on the wall of, okay, we got to get rid of these because these are an embarrassment, and allows these other countries to do what they want, at our expense. But, like I said, this treaty has been ripped up. It's the 1930s. He's spearheading this buildup and modernization of Japan's naval forces. And he's actually starting to train his troops and get them ready for what he knows is, and what's already kind of starting with, what's happening in China and other parts of Asia as the Japanese are starting to expand. But he's known for some untraditional or unorthodox training methods. He famously would place tacks on his staff officers' chairs to sharpen their vigilance. So, always be aware because I might put a tack on your chair. And he actually encouraged them to play poker because he said it would master their bluff and surprise skills, reflecting that his belief that war was half calculation and half luck. It's definitely something he believes in. Maybe he just wanted some people to play with, but I think he did have a deep thing of this is actually good for different strategists to do. He is also really against this very strong, hardline militarism that's coming through the Japanese government. He definitely wants Japan to be strong, no question about it. He definitely wants them to have the best navy. He definitely wants to have the newest technology, but he really does not like that Japan is allying itself with Nazi Germany and Italy. He was really vocal of this and actually put him at risk of assassination. And so when we talked about Harry Truman and the atomic bomb all the way back in our second and third episode, we talked a lot about how these hardliners in Japan would stop at nothing to make sure that these wars continued. And they would do things like try to assassinate prime ministers and really high-ranking Japanese officials. And this is no different before the war. So Yamamoto's actually at risk of assassination. They've actually uncovered a plot to kill him. And to do so, they promoted him to admiral and sent him on a boat and got him out of the country because they were actually worried for his life because he was worried. He didn't like the direction that his country was going in. And especially with allying with Nazi Germany and Italy, who are, imperialistic on, a really high level. He's kind of seeing Japan fall into that. And, with the indiscriminate violence that we're starting to see in China and just the way the Japanese are starting to operate, I think he can start to see the writing on the wall a little bit that, this is not going to end well for Japan. And we're going to get pulled into something that we probably don't want to be in.
Yeah, I came across a similar sentiment in my research that he was a vocal opponent of the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. And it's not necessarily a quote, but he famously stated that he could run wild for 6 months or a year in such a war. But after that, he had no expectation of success. He understood that Japan's only hope lay in a short, decisive conflict, as a prolonged war, he believed, would expose its industrial and resource limitations. So, he was publicly against it.
Absolutely. And you're right. Everything we see with Yamamoto is he says any war that we have, and he's starting to talk with the US, he's starting to talk about Britain. He says it'll come down to two things: time and oil, and we have neither. So if we're going to do this, we're going to have to do it fast, and we're going to have to do it quick, because if we sit around and wait, we're going to get destroyed, because he knows that America's eventually going to come into this battle. The British are definitely going to come. Something's going to happen, especially now that they have this alliance. So with that being said, though, he's very, very outspoken against war with the United States. So there's a quote where he said, should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, or even San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonders if our politicians who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. To fight the United States is like fighting the whole world, but it has been decided, so I will fight my best. Doubtless I will die on board my ship. So he knows what's coming. He's basically saying, look, you guys want to do this, but do you really know what this means? This means, we're going to have to march into the Oval Office and make the president sign a surrender deal, because this isn't going to be just we hit them hard and they're going to surrender. And, he mentions that, it's a mistake to regard Americans as luxury loving and weak. He's like, I can tell you that they are full of spirit, adventure, fight, and justice. Their thinking is scientific. They're well advanced. Remember that the American industry is much more developed than ours. And unlike us, they have all the oil that they want. Japan cannot vanquish the United States. Therefore, we should not fight the United States. And I like that thinking, because it's very common to how the U.S. talked about Japan is, if we're going to get Japan to surrender, we have to march into Tokyo and get the emperor himself to sign some sort of armistice. He's seeing it the other way. He's like, these Americans aren't going to give up. They have so many resources. They have so much land. They have so many people. They are just going to continue to fight till the very end. And ultimately he ends up being right. But he's a loyal Japanese admiral, and he realizes that this is what's going to have to happen, and he's going to do his best for his country. But, even if he doesn't like it, this is just what's going to happen.
And there's this political inertia that's happening again in the backdrop, right? So we've talked about the tripartite pact. This is going to isolate Japan from America. But there's also an oil embargo. So we've talked about oil quite a bit. So the United States, in response to Japan's continued aggression in Asia, particularly its occupation of French Indochina in 1941, imposes a series of increasingly stringent economic sanctions. The most damaging of these is an oil embargo, which essentially cut off Japan's primary source of oil imports. And this action, some historians believe, was a turning point, and it effectively gave Japan a very limited time frame to either negotiate a settlement with the U.S. or secure alternative sources of oil through military conquest. So it's almost like in some ways you could call it a blunder for, aligning with European powers in a war that did not really implicate them. But in the same vein, if you look at Yamamoto, his hand's kind of being forced at this point.
Yeah, it's ultimately, like you said, it's out of his hands, but you're right. He mentions that we don't have enough oil to fight the US, and they're not going to give us any more. We got to go take it from somewhere if we're going to want to get it. But, America's a long way away, and things are going to be very, very difficult. So he's kind of, though, the embodiment of, disagree and commit. Okay, I don't agree with any of this, but we're going to do this, and we're going to do it right. And so I think with him, he realizes that, to your point, okay, we've got this oil embargo. We're going to come into conflict with the US. Either we're going to do it or they're going to do it. But it looks like, my leadership is going to do it. All right, let's do it. And how are we going to do it? He goes, we got to hit them hard, and we got to hit them fast, and we can't wait around and not, we can't declare war. We got to hit them with a surprise attack, and we got to be able to cripple them quickly, because I think in his head, he's thinking, we're going to hit them hard. We're going to win a few decisive battles, fight really offensively, get them to the point where they're on their heels, and then sign a treaty that's favorable to us. I think is kind of his thinking. He may have said, we need to march into Washington, but I think he knows that that's not realistic, but he's kind of calling on his leadership to say, are you going to go, do you have what it takes to go all the way, sacrifice millions of people and billions of dollars to get this done? So he does this preparation. His whole thought is, let's hit them quickly, let's hit them hard, and let's do it while they least expect it. And so, hence the attack of Pearl Harbor. So just a quick overview of what really happens at Pearl Harbor. So Japan and the United States are still at peace on December 7th, 1941. 6 carriers, 350 aircraft, very classic Yamamoto. Like this is what he's been preparing for. Launched 2 waves of attacks against Pearl Harbor and other military sites around Honolulu. The mission succeeded in sinking or damaging much of the U.S.'s Pacific Fleet's battleships. 4 were sunk, 4 more were damaged, and there was a substantial loss in American aircraft and personnel. However, though, 3 U.S. aircraft carriers were actually out at sea, and they were the primary target, but they were out at sea, and I guess a little bit of a failure in Japanese intelligence here. They weren't able to find them, and they escaped unharmed. So it was considered a tactical success, this battle. They came in, they hit them hard, had very little losses, sunk a ton of ships, killed a lot of U.S. military personnel, but they weren't able to find these carriers. And he regretted that his vice admiral actually did not choose to seek and destroy these carriers, and actually ended up retreating. And he didn't call him out after the battle, because he's not going to call out his vice admiral in public, but kind of later basically said that was a huge blunder, that we backed out and really didn't hit them as hard as we could have and attacked other targets within Pearl Harbor, especially like oil reserves and things like that they had on the island. Those were things that, they really should have hit. But like I said, tactically, this is a brilliant success in terms of, they sunk a lot of ships. They really put their stamp on the American psyche on what they did. And, he returned home, an overnight hero. But strategically, this is a disaster for Japan. You have, like the famous saying goes, you've poked a sleeping bear, and here comes the United States. Not only was it, such a surprising attack for the American public, but the fact that it was a sneak attack and kind of that, war wasn't declared, it's going to galvanize the nation even more because it's, we've been attacked by, these sneaky Japanese who we have to get back and we have to defeat. You can't trust them. And that leads to a whole bunch of other problems. But right away, here comes the United States. And here they come very, very quickly. And even for someone like Yamamoto, I'd be curious to see if he was even surprised at how quickly the Americans were able to turn around and turn this war from, an offensive war into a defensive war very, very quickly.
And I think that's such a telling point because I think throughout his entire, through this period of his life, he knows a protracted war against the Americans is not where the Japanese want to be, right? And I think it's such a great point, like tactical success, strategic failure. And, initial reports in Japan indicated this is a great victory, but apparently Yamamoto was reportedly very somber. He knew that the attack had not crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet as much as he had hoped, to your point, Paul. And especially with those American carriers escaping destruction, he's famously quoted as saying, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." I don't know how exact the phrasing is here, but I think it really gets to the point that he understands something that might be lost on some of his Japanese military counterparts.
Yeah, like I said, he knows what this means. He knows that they have to win 3, 4, 5 successive big decisive battles, and they have to do it quickly because, again, time and oil are not on their side in this case. And, that's really what happens. We have the famous Battle of Midway where American code breakers basically knew that Yamamoto was coming. And, there's reports of him just looking at these battle plans and reports and kind of shaking his head going like, what can I do? There's not much I can do here. They knew what I was doing. Chester Nimitz had a smaller force, but they had surprise, better planning, and obviously some luck plays into this. And, this is a loss for Yamamoto. And then on top of that, we have the Doolittle raids where an American carrier basically gets as close to Japan as they can. They launch some American B-25 Mitchell bombers and just kind of bomb Japan in some small areas. Like they don't do a ton of damage, but it hits the Japanese really hard because they're seeing themselves as being invincible, and now they've actually been attacked for the first time. Follow that up with the Battle of the Coral Sea, where huge naval battle, big losses on both sides, but the Americans stopped the Japanese advance. So we're getting to the point where an offensive war is turned into kind of a neutral war, and then within the Solomon Islands, the famous Battle of Guadalcanal, which is really the Americans' first successful battle of stalling Japanese advancement into any of these Pacific islands. And now they can use that as kind of the island hopping movements that they've done to start, going on the offensive themselves. And so, he's now at this point where it's been almost a year, and not only are the Japanese not winning these decisive battles, they're actually on their heels now. Maybe not quite on their heels, but they're moving definitely back, or they're kind of sitting stagnant. And it's going to be a long time, and we know what kind of happens in the war in the Pacific. But for Yamamoto, he famously says in spring of 1943, he acknowledges this grim outlook, and he basically says, "Yeah, I'll probably be dead within 100 days." He's like, "There's just no way that this is going to end well for me." But again, he's a loyal soldier. He wants to win as many battles as he can, and he's not going to leave his troops, out to dry. But, if anyone knows the writings on the wall, he's seeing this, probably the day after Pearl Harbor, but he's also, if he didn't see it then, he absolutely sees it now. Not only does he see Japan probably losing this war, but, he sees himself not lasting very long.
The foresight he had is incredible, right? Don't get into a protracted war. Do not get into a war of attrition. We will lose. What ultimately ends up happening, they do have some early decisive wins, but those prolonged long-term battles, they end up losing. They end up fighting a protracted war. They end up fighting a war of attrition. And now the writing's on the wall. For him to call out his death in 100 days is pretty remarkable. And, he might have gotten pretty close to that estimate.
I think that's the most remarkable remarkable thing is we talk about leadership and foresight being so important. He's basically had the foresight for everything here, and calling his own death is even kind of a little creepy, but he manages to do that, unfortunately, for himself. So, characteristically, he's not hesitant to venture into combat zones. He wants to go and, inspect the troops. He wants to get close to the front lines and make sure that basically everything is going as is intended. But like we mentioned, the U.S. has cracked the Japanese code, and they know that he's making some of these maneuvers. So Admiral Nimitz sends the decoded information back to Washington and basically says, can you authorize an assassination mission on Yamamoto? And basically there's an answer that comes back, and it just says yes. And so there's some rumors that Roosevelt actually had to sign off on this. We don't have evidence of that, but it definitely went up very high in Washington for this. So on April 18th, 1943, he's on a flight out in the area around Guadalcanal, and a flight of 16 P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field in Guadalcanal ambushed Yamamoto's bomber as it approached an airfield and shot it down. Essentially, the burning plane crashed in the dense jungle, and then there were no survivors. So they confirmed that he was actually on the plane. The Japanese go recover his body, and he's sent back to Japan and given a state funeral where over 1 million people are in attendance. So just to give you an idea, we talk about, when we mentioned he's a rock star, an overnight success, this funeral is attended by 1 million people. But I think the most interesting thing about this is it's kind of the last proper military parade or kind of military thing they would do on a large scale to honor something militaristic in Japan, just because at this point things are starting to go really, really poorly, and resources are going to be spent otherwise. But that's kind of his end, and I think it's a very fitting end for someone who can predict his own death, but knew that going down this route wasn't the right decision, but also pushed Japan to a point where the Americans are not definitely looking at the Japanese lightly, and definitely knew that this was going to be a very, very tough war, which it ended up being. And especially early on with how formidable the Japanese Eurofighters were and how formidable the Japanese Navy was, it really has to go back to a lot of the work that Yamamoto did. But to die in the line of battle, I don't think there would have been any other ending for someone like him.
It's always interesting talking about the legacy of a military leader in some respects, right? Because I know we talk, we run a history podcast, and we do a lot of episodes in this era on military leaders, military leadership, strategic thinking. People died, right? Like the Pearl Harbor attack is one of the most infamous attacks to ever happen on American soil. So I think, when we ground all of it, and at least in my mind, war is messy. And you have to kind of isolate for that. And in a weird way, you have to kind of push that to the side to look at Yamamoto as a leader and a person in isolation. And I think, from all the episodes that we've done, he has so many of the characteristics that we've seen, I think, that really do make a formidable leader, which is, intelligence, hardworking, driven, foresight. He's a very strategic thinker. He understands the world that he's operating in very well. He understands all the parties that are in play, and he's got such a level of intelligence about the things that matter most. And he's so highly educated. It's quite incredible, his resume on a whole, that, like, to me, I think this has actually been one of the more fascinating episodes that we've done up to this point, on a leader that, people, when you Google him, architect of Pearl Harbor, which I think sells his story a bit short in many ways.
Absolutely. And I think that's how we came into this. We're like, oh yeah, that Pearl Harbor guy, right? Let's look up him a little bit. And you're right. There's so much more to him. And I think what I'm taking away the most from this is his openness to new ideas. I think is what I think has fascinated me the most, is how he's not stuck in kind of the old world of Japan. I don't think he ever would have got to the point if he was, but even as he moves through the political apparatus coming closer to World War II, he doesn't fall into that hardline Japanese kind of imperialist kind of sentiment that's really galvanizing a lot of these, even if he's not a hardliner, but even more, kind of on that spectrum. He's very kind of, what's the evidence show me? What's the facts show me? And the facts show me that the Americans have a lot of oil and a lot of time. And those are the two things that are the most important to me. But I'm a loyal soldier, and I'm going to do what's asked of me. And I think there's a lot of respect that you can have to someone who's able to say, hey, yeah, this might bring the end to me and the destruction of my nation, but there's nothing I can do to stop it. So, we'll give him hell as long as we can. And, eventually, it leads to his death. But, I think with all the things that you mentioned, plus kind of those couple pieces, he's definitely going to go down as, one of the greats, I think, when it comes to talking about the generals that we've talked about. And I really like the fact that he's not just, hey, he was really good tactically. He's also so good strategically, not just within, a 6-month period and how we're going to strategically tackle this and that. It's strategically from a warfare perspective. How do we modernize? How do we industrialize? And how do we really push Japan forward to the point where, we're going to be the ultimate power in the Pacific for a good chunk of time until, the writing is on the wall.
It's interesting too, and this will probably be our closing note, but, often when we do these episodes on World War II and, military leaders, we often talk about a lot of propaganda. I know we didn't touch on it a lot on this episode, but, there's nothing that really comes out to make me think that he hated the Americans, right? Like, I think in many ways he respected them for what they were able to accomplish and how many resources that they had and the industrial might behind them. And I think that's a very unique perspective that we don't often see with leaders in this era, especially from a military perspective, because there's always this kind of subtext of, hate or the other. Whereas I think with his openness to ideas and having the experiences he did really did make him a pretty balanced and calculated guy. And you can see that in those sentiments, from putting tax on chairs to making people play poker so they could figure out what the strategic, value was and being able to bluff effectively. So I think there's a lot of interesting, takeaways for me, at least.
Absolutely. You're right. It's this, know thy enemy like thyself or something. I'm sure there's some quote like that. It's important. And he understands that. And he definitely not only learns a lot about his enemy, but kind of became friends with a lot of them, keep your enemies closer. And I think you're right. He could just easily write them off as these odorous barbarians who are potentially cannibals, or he can see them as a very industrialized nation that is to be feared and to be not taken lightly, and ultimately ends up being very right in that sense. So, I think he's definitely not sitting there being like, yeah, I told you so, but, ultimately being right, I think maybe brings a little bit of, I don't know, as we wrap up and say, yeah, he not only did he have the foresight, he was just also very, very correct in a lot of the things that he decided. And, ultimately it didn't work out for him in the very end, but, you can see that all of those things were there. And, it would be interesting to see if he lived to fight another day, but it's not always like that. So yeah, I think this has been a good one to kind of wrap up on, this part of World War II. And I think it's nice to kind of look at some of the, we see things definitely more from an American perspective, a Western perspective. I really like doing these episodes and seeing kind of what's being said on the other side. And I think we're at a good time in history too, where we actually have access to learn a lot about this kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely, I think a spot we'll come back to a lot more in the future, whether it's Japan or just, on the other side from a World War II perspective.
Well said.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Till next time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.